The midday sun cast a warm glow over the sleepy southern town as Sarah pushed open the door of the local cafe. The bell above the door jingled, announcing her arrival to the familiar crowd of townsfolk exchanging gossip over coffee and pie. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. She nodded politely to Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly baker, and slid into her usual corner booth. Just as she was about to open her book, the atmosphere in the cafe shifted. A man stepped inside, a tall, muscular black biker dressed in worn leather. His boots clicked against the tile floor as he walked to the counter, his helmet tucked under one arm. Silence blanketed the cafe like a heavy fog. Conversations stopped. Forks hovered midair. "Coffee black," the man said, his voice deep but calm. The waitress behind the counter hesitated, her eyes darting to the customers for approval. Sarah watched the scene unfold, her stomach tightening at the blatant hostility. When the waitress made no move to pour the coffee, Sarah stood. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "He's a paying customer, isn't he?" The waitress stammered. Yes, ma'am. Of course." Sarah stared her down until the coffee was poured and handed over. The biker gave her a small nod of thanks, his lips pressing into a thin line. He took his cup and found a seat at a table in the far corner, ignoring the stares boring into his back. Sarah returned to her booth, trying to ignore the murmurs around her, but she couldn't ignore the heat of disapproving eyes. The afternoon sun was blazing when Sarah left the cafe. As she crossed the parking lot to her car, she noticed the biker crouched next to his motorcycle, a sleek black machine that looked as travel-worn as its owner. Tools were scattered around his feet, and frustration was etched on his face. "Need a hand?" she asked, approaching cautiously. He looked up, clearly surprised. "I got it," he said gruffly, turning back to the bike. Sarah didn't move. "Looks like you're in a tough spot. I know a thing or two about engines. Mind if I take a look?" He hesitated before finally nodding. "Suit yourself." She crouched beside him, inspecting the bike. "What happened?" "Chain's worn out. Needs a replacement, but the nearest shop said they don't carry the part. Special order." Sarah frowned. "That could take days." "Yeah," he muttered. "I'll figure something out." "Like what?" She straightened, hands on her hips. "Sleep outside in this heat? That's ridiculous." He chuckled dryly. "Lady, I'm used to being unwelcome. I'll manage." "Not on my watch," she said firmly. "You can stay at my place until the part arrives." He blinked, clearly startled. "You serious?" "Completely. It's the least I can do after the way people treated you back there." The biker studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Name's Elijah." "Sarah," she replied, extending a hand. He shook it, his grip firm but careful. Sarah's modest home sat on the edge of town, surrounded by a white picket fence and a garden bursting with flowers. As she pulled into the driveway with Elijah following on foot, her teenage daughter Emma came out to greet her. "Hey, Mom!" Emma's voice trailed off as she spotted Elijah. "Emma, this is Elijah. He's having some trouble with his bike, so he'll be staying with us for a few days." Emma's eyes widened, and she gave her mother a questioning look. Sure. Okay." Inside, Sarah showed Elijah the guest room, a small but comfortable space with a single bed and a window overlooking the garden. "Make yourself at home," she said. "Dinner's at 6. "Thanks," Elijah said, his voice quiet but sincere. Meanwhile, at the local hardware store, Chuck leaned against the counter, spinning a wrench in his hand. "You hear about Sarah?" he asked the clerk, his tone laced with amusement. "What about her?" "She brought that biker into her house. Can you believe that?" The clerk frowned. "The black guy? From the cafe? That's the one. She's crazy, letting someone like that stay with her. Who knows what he's up to?" A few other customers overheard and joined in, their voices a chorus of judgment. By the time Chuck left the store, the rumor had spread like wildfire. Back at her home, Sarah was on the phone with the nearest repair shop, explaining the situation. "I need a chain for a 2006 Harley. How soon can you get it?" "3 to 5 days, ma'am." the man on the other end replied. Sarah sighed. Fine. Order it, please. When she hung up, she found Elijah in the garden, fixing the sagging fence. You don't have to do that, she said. I don't like sitting around, he replied, hammering a nail into place. Figured I'd make myself useful. After dinner, Sarah and Elijah sat on the porch, sipping iced tea. The night was cool, the sky a blanket of stars. Why are you traveling alone? Sarah asked. Elijah stared into the distance before answering. My dad passed away last year. He was a biker too. Always said he wanted to ride across the country. Never got the chance, so I'm doing it for him. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of his words. That's a beautiful way to honor him. Elijah smiled faintly. He always said people were kinder than they seemed. I guess he was right about you. The next day, Sarah and Elijah visited the repair shop to confirm the part's arrival. As they entered, the mechanic barely glanced at them. His tone was clipped as he gave them the information they needed. Outside, Elijah shook his head. I've seen that look 100 times. Like I don't belong. You belong as much as anyone else, Sarah said fiercely. Don't let them make you think otherwise. That evening, Sarah's friend Laura showed up, her face a mask of concern. Sarah, what are you doing? People are talking. Let them talk, Sarah replied coolly. You're putting yourself in danger. You don't know this man. I know enough, Sarah shot back. He's a good person, and he needs help. That's all that matters. Laura sighed, shaking her head. You're braver than me. Or crazier. Maybe both, Sarah said with a smile. But as she closed the door behind Laura, the weight of the town's disapproval pressed down on her. Still, she stood by her decision. The morning sun warmed the garden as Sarah stepped outside with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She found Elijah sitting on the porch steps, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He looked at peace, though his leather jacket bore the wear and tear of the road. She handed him a mug, and he nodded in thanks. Quiet here, he said, taking a sip. I'm not used to that. Sarah smiled. It grows on you. Her eyes drifted to the sagging fence near the edge of her yard. It had been on her to-do list for months, but she never found the time. Elijah followed her gaze and stood, setting his mug down. That fence won't fix itself, he said, his voice low but determined. Mind if I take a look? Before she could respond, he was already walking toward it, his hands testing the loose planks. Sarah showed him to the shed, where he found a toolbox. She offered to help, but he waved her off. Got this, he said simply. From the kitchen window, Emma watched as Elijah worked. His movements were methodical, his hands steady as he hammered nails and reinforced the structure. He's good with tools, she commented to her mother when Sarah came inside. Sarah glanced outside, her lips curving into a small smile. He is. When the fence was finished, Elijah returned to the porch, wiping sweat from his brow. Sarah handed him a tall glass of lemonade, and he accepted it gratefully. Thanks for that, she said, motioning toward the repaired fence. Elijah shrugged. Can't sit still too long. Your dad taught you? She asked, curious. He nodded, his expression softening. He was a mechanic. Always said there's nothing you can't fix with the right tools and patience. Sarah smiled. Wise man. Elijah decided to walk into town that afternoon to grab some supplies. The grocery store was small and dimly lit, with shelves packed tightly together. As he stepped inside, conversations hushed and every eye turned to him. He moved through the aisles, grabbing a loaf of bread and a pack of bottled water. At the checkout counter, he placed his items down, but before the cashier could ring them up, a voice interrupted. You lost, biker? Elijah turned slowly. Chuck stood behind him, flanked by 2 men. They wore smug expressions, their postures casual but threatening. Just here to shop, Elijah replied evenly. Chuck stepped closer, blocking the way. Folks around here don't like strangers, especially ones like you. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his items and handed cash to the cashier, who looked too frightened to speak. Gonna pretend I didn't hear that, Elijah said quietly as he picked up his bag. He turned to leave, but Chuck wasn't done. You better keep moving once that bike's fixed, Chuck called after him. People like you don't belong here. Before Elijah could respond, Sarah's voice rang out. What's your problem, Chuck? Chuck turned to see Sarah standing at the entrance, her arms crossed and her eyes blazing. He hasn't done anything to you, she continued. Why don't you mind your own business? Chuck chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. Just looking out for the town, Sarah. You ought to do the same. Sarah glared at him as he and his group left. She approached Elijah, her face tight with anger. Are you okay? Fine, Elijah said, though his eyes betrayed his frustration. It's not the first time. It shouldn't happen at all, Sarah said fiercely. That evening, the town square was buzzing with chatter. Residents gathered for a meeting about the upcoming fall festival, but whispers about Sarah's new house guest dominated the air. As the mayor stood at the podium, one of Sarah's neighbors, Mrs. Parker, raised her hand. Before we continue, I think we need to address something, she said, her voice sharp. The room fell silent. Mrs. Parker turned to Sarah, her expression cold. You've brought a stranger into this town, a man we know nothing about. Don't you think that's dangerous? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah stood, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Elijah isn't dangerous. He's just passing through, and he needed help. That's not the point, another voice interjected. It was Mr. Thompson, the owner of the local diner. You're putting yourself and this town at risk. Sarah squared her shoulders. Risk of what? Kindness? Compassion? He's done nothing but try to fix his bike and move on. The mayor cleared his throat, trying to calm the room. Sarah, no one's questioning your intentions, but you know how this town is. People are uneasy. Sarah's gaze swept over the room. Maybe it's time this town changed. Her words hung in the air, met with a mix of silence and disapproval. She sat down, her heart sinking but her resolve unshaken. When Sarah returned home, she found Elijah pacing in the living room. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by agitation. You don't have to fight my battles, he said as soon as she walked in. Sarah frowned. I'm not fighting your battles. I'm standing up for what's right. Elijah shook his head. You don't get it. People like Chuck, they're always looking for someone to hate. You standing up for me just makes you a target. Let them target me, Sarah shot back. I won't stand by and watch them treat you like this. Elijah sighed, his shoulders sagging. You're sticking your neck out for someone you barely know. Sarah's voice softened. I know enough, Elijah. And what I know is that you deserve better than this. The next morning, Emma approached Elijah with a tray of sandwiches. I made these for you, she said shyly. Elijah smiled, taking one. Thanks. Emma hesitated, then asked, What's it like? Riding across the country? Elijah took a bite, thinking, It's freedom, he said finally, and loneliness, but it's worth it. Emma nodded, her eyes bright with curiosity. I'd like to do that someday. Elijah chuckled. You should. The road has a way of teaching you things no one else can. That night, the roar of a truck engine shattered the quiet. Headlights illuminated Sarah's front yard as Chuck and his cronies drove by, shouting insults and honking their horn. One of them threw a bottle, which shattered on the pavement. Inside, Sarah and Elijah stood by the window, watching. They're trying to scare you, Elijah said. Don't let them win. I won't, Sarah said, though her hands trembled. The next day, Elijah confronted Chuck outside the hardware store. You got a problem with me? Say it to my face, he said, his voice calm but firm. Chuck smirked. You think you're tough? No, Elijah replied. I just want to know why you hate me. Chuck faltered, his smirk fading. People like you don't belong here. Elijah stepped closer, his gaze steady. Maybe it's time that changed. That evening, Sarah invited a few open-minded neighbors over for dinner. They hesitated at first, but eventually accepted. The group shared stories, laughter, and food, creating a moment of unity that felt rare in the divided town. For the first time, Sarah saw hope, a flicker of change, however small. And as Elijah shared a story about his father's kindness, she realized that change always starts with one person willing to take a stand. The morning light revealed the ugly truth. Sarah stood in her front yard, staring at her once pristine white fence, now defaced with hateful graffiti. Bold red letters spelled out slurs and threats, dripping like blood onto the grass below. Emma gasped when she saw it. "Mom, who did this?" Sarah didn't need to guess. "Chuck," she said quietly, her voice tight with anger. Elijah joined them, his face hard as stone. "I'll fix it," he said, grabbing a bucket and a brush. Sarah stopped him. "No, this isn't your mess to clean up." Elijah looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's not about whose mess it is. It's about showing them we won't back down." Together, they worked in silence, scrubbing the hateful words away. Neighbors passed by, some with disapproving looks, others with sympathy, but no one stopped to help. When the job was done, Elijah turned to Sarah. "They're trying to scare you into giving up." Sarah straightened, her eyes fierce. "They don't know me very well." That evening, Elijah sat on the porch, staring into the darkening sky. Sarah joined him, handing him a glass of iced tea. "I've been thinking," Elijah said, "about this town, about people like Chuck." Sarah sipped her tea, waiting for him to continue. "They act out of fear," Elijah said. "Fear of change, fear of losing control. But fear's a funny thing. It only has power if you let it." Sarah nodded. "What are you thinking?" Elijah looked at her, a glint of determination in his eyes. "A ride, a community ride. Bikers from all over, coming together to show this town what unity looks like." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You think that'll work?" "I think it'll make them listen," Elijah said. "And if it doesn't, at least we'll show them we're not afraid." Word spread quickly. Elijah reached out to fellow bikers through online forums and phone calls. Sarah helped him print flyers and post them around nearby towns. The morning of the ride dawned bright and clear. By noon, the rumble of engines filled the air as bikers arrived one by one. Men and women of all races and backgrounds, clad in leather and helmets, gathered in Sarah's front yard. Emma watched from the porch, her eyes wide with excitement. "There are so many of them," she whispered. Elijah grinned. "Told you bikers stick together." Sarah stood beside him, her heart swelling with pride. "Let's do this." The bikers rode into town in a long, roaring procession. Residents lined the streets, watching with a mix of awe and apprehension. Some cheered, but others crossed their arms, their faces set in disapproval. Chuck and his cronies stood at the town square, their trucks parked across the road to block the procession. Elijah brought the ride to a halt, dismounting his bike and walking toward Chuck. "You really want to do this?" Elijah asked, his voice steady. Chuck smirked. "You think you can just roll in here and change how things are?" "I think you're scared," Elijah said. "Scared of what you don't understand." Chuck stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You don't belong here." Elijah held his ground. "I belong wherever I choose to stand. Just like you." The standoff drew the attention of the crowd. Whispers spread, and someone called out, "Let them pass, Chuck." Others joined in, their voices growing louder. The mayor stepped forward, her expression stern. "Enough, Chuck. Let them through." Chuck hesitated, his pride warring with the pressure of the crowd. Finally, he stepped aside, his face dark with anger. Elijah turned back to the bikers, nodding. The procession continued, the roar of engines drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. As the day went on, more residents came out to watch the ride. A few even joined in, inspired by the bikers' message of unity. Children waved from their front yards, and some shopkeepers offered water and snacks to the riders. Sarah noticed the shift, small but significant. For every scowl, there was a smile. For every muttered insult, there was a word of support. By the time the ride ended, the town felt different. Not completely changed, but cracked open, ready for something new. That evening, Elijah prepared to leave. His bike, repaired and polished, gleamed in the setting sun. Sarah, Emma, and a small group of neighbors gathered to see him off. "You sure you have to go?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with sadness. Elijah smiled. "The road's calling, but I'll be back. promise. He turned to Sarah, his expression soft. Thank you. For everything. Sarah shook her head. You did more for this town than I ever could. Thank you. They embraced, and Elijah climbed onto his bike. The engine roared to life, and with a final wave, he rode off into the horizon. In the weeks that followed, Sarah noticed small but meaningful changes in the town. Neighbors who had once avoided her now stopped to chat. The cafe that had ignored Elijah's presence started serving all customers equally. And Chuck? He kept his distance. His influence diminished. Emma joined Sarah in repainting the fence, this time adding a colorful mural, a symbol of hope and resilience. Think he'll come back? Emma asked as they worked. I know he will, Sarah replied with a smile. Months later, a letter arrived in Sarah's mailbox. It was from Elijah, accompanied by a photo of him standing by his bike at the Grand Canyon. Thanks for giving me a reason to believe again, the note read. Sarah placed the letter on her mantle, her heart full. The town wasn't perfect, but it was better, and she knew that as long as people were willing to stand up for what was right, change was always possible. Despite the ride's success, not everyone was ready to accept the change. Chuck and his cronies met late at night in the local bar, their anger bubbling over into action. They're trying to make us look weak, Chuck growled, slamming his fist on the table. We're not letting this slide. One of his followers hesitated, but a lot of people seem fine with him now. Maybe we should let it go. Chuck shot him a dark look. You want to let them walk all over us? No. They need a reminder of who runs this town. The next morning, Sarah woke to find another hateful message on her front yard. This time, scrawled across the freshly painted mural. The words were cruel, but Sarah refused to let them break her. Emma stood beside her, her fists clenched. They're cowards. Yes, they are, Sarah said, her voice steady. But we'll fix this. Again. Later that day, Sarah went into town to buy more paint. She noticed how the town was splitting. Some people smiled at her, offering support, while others turned away, their faces cold. As Sarah returned home, she found the mayor waiting on her porch. The older woman looked uneasy, clutching a file in her hands. Mayor Thompson, Sarah said cautiously, what can I do for you? The mayor sighed. I wanted to apologize. I've spent too long sitting on the fence, trying to keep everyone happy. But what Chuck's doing, it's wrong. Sarah raised an eyebrow. And you're telling me this because? The mayor handed her the file. This is everything I've gathered on Chuck and his group. They'd been behind most of the vandalism in town for years. I couldn't act before because I didn't have enough support, but now, people are starting to see them for what they are. Sarah took the file, surprised but grateful. Thank you. The next town meeting was tense. Sarah presented the evidence against Chuck, laying bare his pattern of harassment and intimidation. Chuck was there, his face a mask of rage. This is a witch hunt, he shouted. You're all being fooled by outsiders and bleeding hearts. But Sarah didn't back down. This isn't about outsiders. It's about decency. It's about what kind of town we want to be. For the first time, people in the room began to question Chuck openly. His support wavered, though some still clung to his rhetoric. Inspired by her mother's courage, Emma decided to organize a school event focused on diversity and inclusion. She enlisted her friends to create posters and invite speakers from nearby towns. The principal was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. If this goes well, he said, it could be something special. Emma's excitement grew as the event approached. We're going to show everyone that the next generation doesn't believe in hate, she told her mom. Sarah hugged her, proud of her daughter's bravery. With his influence slipping, Chuck grew desperate. He and his cronies began targeting businesses that supported Sarah, leaving threatening notes and damaging property. The mayor, emboldened by Sarah's evidence, issued a public statement condemning the actions. This town will not tolerate threats or violence, she declared. We're better than that. Law enforcement, previously hesitant, began investigating Chuck's group more seriously. Chuck realized his time was running out. The day of Emma's event arrived. The school auditorium was packed with students, parents, and even some townsfolk who were curious about the message of inclusion. Emma stood on stage, her voice clear and confident. Hate only wins when we let it. But we have the power to choose kindness, to choose understanding. The audience erupted in applause. Several speakers shared stories of overcoming prejudice, moving many to tears. Sarah watched from the back, her heart swelling with pride. She noticed Elijah's name among the list of online contributors who had supported Emma's cause financially. In the weeks following the event, Chuck's power continued to fade. His followers dwindled, and his threats lost their weight. The town began to heal, slowly but surely. Elijah sent Sarah a letter, letting her know he was planning another visit. "The road brought me to your town for a reason," he wrote. "And maybe it's not done with me there yet." Sarah smiled as she read the letter. Change had come to the town, and while the scars of its past remained, they no longer defined its future. The sound of a motorcycle echoed down Sarah's street one crisp morning, drawing curious gazes from neighbors. Emma rushed to the window, her face lighting up. "It's him!" she shouted, running to the door. Elijah dismounted his bike, removing his helmet to reveal a smile. Sarah walked out to greet him, a warmth in her expression that hadn't been there months ago. "Back so soon?" she teased. "Figured I'd check on my favorite town," Elijah replied. "How's the fence holding up?" "Better than ever," Sarah said, shaking his hand. "Welcome back." That evening, Elijah sat with Sarah and Emma on the porch, the three of them sharing stories under the stars. As they talked, Elijah revealed the true purpose of his visit. "I've been talking with some folks I met on the road," he said. "They're bikers like me, but they also run community outreach programs, food drives, repair workshops, things like that. I was thinking, maybe we could start something like that here." Sarah's eyes widened. "You think this town would go for it?" Elijah shrugged. "It's worth a shot. People are already starting to come around. Maybe this could help them see we're not so different after all." Emma grinned. "That sounds amazing." Elijah and Sarah began reaching out to local organizations, proposing the idea of a community outreach program. To their surprise, many were receptive. The first event was a free motorcycle repair workshop hosted in the high school parking lot. Elijah brought in a few biker friends, and together they taught locals how to perform basic maintenance on their bikes and cars. At first, attendance was sparse, but word spread quickly. By the end of the day, the parking lot was bustling with activity, laughter, and a sense of camaraderie. Not everyone was happy about the changes. Chuck, now a shadow of his former self, showed up at the event, his scowl as deep as ever. "What's this supposed to prove?" he sneered, watching Elijah teach a group of teenagers how to change a tire. Elijah straightened, meeting Chuck's gaze. "It's not about proving anything. It's about helping people." Chuck snorted. "You think a few charity events will change this town?" "No," Elijah said calmly, "but it's a start." Chuck shook his head and walked away, but his words carried little weight now. The crowd barely noticed him leave. Inspired by the success of the workshop, Emma took the lead in organizing the next event, a town cleanup day. She rallied her classmates, local businesses, and even a few of Chuck's former supporters to join in. The cleanup day was a resounding success. Neighbors worked side by side, tearing down old prejudices along with overgrown weeds and broken fences. Sarah watched proudly as Emma coordinated the efforts, her voice confident and her spirit infectious. One day, Sarah found Elijah painting a mural on the side of the old hardware store. The image depicted a motorcycle on an open road, with words above it that read, "Freedom through unity." "It's beautiful," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's what this town needs to see," Elijah replied. "A reminder of where we've been and where we're going." The mural quickly became a symbol of the town's transformation. People began taking photos with it, sharing their pride in the changes their community was undergoing. One morning, Sarah noticed a moving truck parked in front of Chuck's house. By afternoon, he and his cronies were gone. No one seemed to know where they went, and few seemed to care. Without Chuck's influence, the town felt lighter, freer. People began to embrace the changes, no longer held back by fear or prejudice. To celebrate the town's progress, Elijah and Sarah organized a community picnic in the park. The event drew people from all walks of life, bikers, families, students, and elders, all coming together to share food and stories. Elijah stood up to speak, his voice carrying over the crowd. This town taught me something I'll never forget. Change starts small. It starts with one act of kindness, one person willing to step up. And before you know it, that spark spreads. The crowd erupted in applause, their faces shining with hope. Months after the picnic, Sarah and Elijah gathered at the local town hall with a group of volunteers. The room buzzed with energy as they brainstormed ideas for the next steps in their community outreach efforts. We've made progress here, Elijah began. But there are other towns nearby facing the same struggles. What if we expanded this? A network of outreach programs, each inspired by what we've started here. Sarah nodded. We can partner with churches, schools, and even biker clubs. It could be a movement. Emma, who had joined the meeting, added, we can use social media to spread the word and get more people involved. The group left the meeting energized, ready to take their vision beyond the borders of their small town. As Elijah and Sarah began reaching out to neighboring towns, they encountered resistance. Some community leaders refused to meet with them, and others dismissed their ideas outright. In one particularly tense meeting, a councilman from a nearby town leaned back in his chair and sneered, we don't need outsiders coming in and telling us how to run things. Elijah stayed calm. I'm not here to tell you how to run anything. I'm here to offer support, tools, ideas, resources. The rest is up to you. Though the councilman remained unconvinced, a few members of the audience approached them afterward, quietly expressing interest. It's not about convincing everyone, Sarah reminded Elijah later. It's about finding the ones who are ready. Over the next several months, Elijah's vision began to take shape. Partnering with Sarah, Emma, and other volunteers, he established connections with like-minded individuals in nearby towns. Workshops, community meals, and cleanup events began popping up in places where skepticism had once reigned. Each event brought people together and challenged old prejudices, one small step at a time. One afternoon, Sarah found Emma poring over college applications at the kitchen table. What's all this? Sarah asked, sitting down beside her. Emma smiled. I've been thinking about studying social work. Everything we've done here. It made me realize I want to help people for the rest of my life. Sarah's heart swelled with pride. You'll be amazing. A few weeks later, Emma received a scholarship for her essay about the power of community. She dedicated the award to Sarah and Elijah, crediting them with inspiring her journey. Just when things seemed to be progressing smoothly, a key event in a neighboring town was sabotaged. Vandals destroyed banners, tables, and supplies the night before a scheduled outreach fair. Elijah arrived at the scene early, his heart sinking at the damage. Volunteers stood around, dejected. Whoever did this wanted to stop us, Elijah said, his voice firm. Let's show them they didn't. He rallied the volunteers, and with help from nearby towns, the fair went on as planned. The turnout was even bigger than expected, a testament to the community's resilience. Word of the outreach efforts began spreading beyond the region. A journalist from a major news outlet contacted Sarah and Elijah, asking to write a story about their work. During the interview, Sarah spoke candidly. This started as an act of kindness, one person helping another, but it's grown into something so much bigger. It's about connection, understanding, and building something better together. Elijah added, we've still got a long way to go, but if we've learned anything, it's that change is possible, even in the hardest places. The article went viral, drawing national attention and offers of support from across the country. One evening, a group of bikers arrived unexpectedly at Sarah's house. Elijah stepped outside to greet them, his face breaking into a wide grin. Long time no see, said a man with a leather jacket covered in patches. Heard what you're doing out here. Figured we'd come see for ourselves and maybe lend a hand. The bikers, many of whom Elijah had met during his travels, stayed for a week, helping organize events and offering their skills. Their presence brought a sense of solidarity and strength to the growing movement. A year after the first ride through Sarah's town, Elijah and Sarah hosted a regional summit, inviting leaders from towns that had embraced their outreach model. The summit featured workshops, panels, and discussions, focusing on how to sustain and grow the movement. Emma delivered the keynote speech, sharing her perspective as a young leader inspired by her community. As the summit concluded, Elijah stood on stage, looking out at the diverse crowd. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning. Together, we're proving that hate doesn't have to win, that unity is stronger. Let's keep riding forward." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the hall. Elijah, Sarah, and Emma sat in Sarah's living room late one evening, the coffee table piled high with maps, notebooks, and a laptop displaying a list of towns. "We've built something incredible here," Elijah began, pointing to their town on the map. "But if we want this to last, we need a plan, something sustainable." Sarah nodded, taking notes. "We need to focus on partnerships. Churches, schools, local businesses. Each town needs a team that believes in the mission." Emma added, "And we should start a mentoring program. People like Elijah can train others to lead in their communities." They worked late into the night, crafting a roadmap to expand their efforts while staying true to their core values: unity, understanding, and empowerment. As their movement grew, so did opposition. In one town, a group of locals staged a protest against an outreach event, holding signs that read, "Keep our town ours," and "No outsiders." Sarah and Elijah arrived to a tense scene. Volunteers stood uncertainly as the protesters chanted. Elijah stepped forward, his calm presence commanding attention. "Why are you afraid of us?" he asked, addressing the crowd directly. A man in the front shouted, "You're trying to change who we are." Elijah nodded. "You're right. I am trying to change something. Hate, fear, division. I want to replace those things with understanding and connection. If that's a threat, then maybe it's time to rethink what we stand for." His words hung in the air. Some protesters looked away, while others hesitated. A few lowered their signs and walked away. The event continued, with more attendees showing up than expected. Sarah later said, "Sometimes the loudest voices are the most fragile. We just have to keep speaking louder with our actions." Emma received her college acceptance letter to a prestigious social work program. The entire town celebrated her achievement, seeing her as a beacon of hope and progress. Before she left, Elijah pulled her aside. "You're going to change lives, Emma, but don't forget where you started." Emma smiled. "I couldn't if I tried. You and Mom showed me what's possible. I'll take that with me wherever I go." At her going-away party, she promised to stay connected to the movement, helping from afar and returning whenever she could. Elijah and Sarah focused on building stronger partnerships with regional leaders. They met with church pastors, school principals, and even business owners to explain their vision. In one memorable meeting, a skeptical pastor asked Elijah, "What makes you think this will work?" Elijah leaned forward, his voice steady. "Because it already has. This isn't about me or Sarah. It's about giving people the tools to see each other as human. That's something every community can benefit from." The pastor eventually joined their efforts, hosting a community dialogue night that drew an unexpectedly large crowd. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Sarah sat on the porch with Elijah. The air was thick with the scent of rain, and the distant rumble of thunder mirrored her mood. "Do you ever feel like we're fighting an uphill battle?" she asked, staring into the darkness. Elijah nodded. "Every day. But every time I see someone change their mind, just one person, it reminds me why we're doing this." Sarah smiled faintly. "You always know the right thing to say." "No," Elijah said, shaking his head. "I just know what my father would have said. He believed that the road gets easier the more people join you on it." Their vision took a giant leap forward with the launch of their first training conference for community leaders. Held in a nearby city, the event attracted attendees from over a dozen towns. Workshops cover topics like conflict resolution, community organizing, and how to counter hate with compassion. Elijah led a session on the power of the road, sharing his journey and how it inspired the movement. One participant, a young man named Lucas, approached Elijah after the session. "I came here because my town feels stuck," Lucas admitted. "But hearing your story gave me hope. I want to be part of this." Elijah smiled. "Then you already are." The movement hit a major milestone when a regional newspaper published a front-page story about their work. Titled Riding Toward Change, the article highlighted the impact Elijah and Sarah's efforts had on struggling towns. The article led to an influx of donations and volunteers. Local businesses began offering sponsorships, and larger organizations reached out, eager to partner. At a celebratory dinner, Sarah raised a toast. To everyone who believed in this, even when it seemed impossible, this is just the beginning. 1 year after the first community ride, their hometown looked almost unrecognizable. The mural Elijah painted had become a symbol of unity, attracting visitors from nearby towns. Businesses thrived as more people embraced the changes in the local cafe. Once a place of tension, became a hub for open dialogue. At a town gathering, the mayor publicly honored Sarah, Elijah, and Emma for their contributions. "This town is stronger because of them," she said. "They reminded us of the power of courage and compassion." As the crowd applauded, Elijah turned to Sarah. "Looks like your town isn't so small anymore." Sarah smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "No, it's not." The regional conference had sparked a wildfire of interest, and within months, Sarah, Elijah, and their growing team were fielding calls from towns across the state. Each request carried a unique story. A struggling factory town looking to mend racial divides, a farming community grappling with generational prejudice, and a city neighborhood torn apart by economic disparities. At their first team meeting after the conference, Sarah spread out a map on the dining table. Dozens of towns were circled, each representing an opportunity for change. "This is bigger than we ever imagined," Sarah said, her voice tinged with awe. Elijah nodded. "It's not just about outreach anymore. It's about creating leaders who can carry this forward." They decided to establish a leadership training program, teaching participants how to replicate their model in their own communities. Elijah and Sarah launched the Unity Leadership Academy, a 6-week program held in their town. The curriculum combined practical skills like event planning and fundraising with deeper lessons on empathy, listening, and bridging divides. Participants came from all walks of life: a retired school teacher, a factory worker, a young activist, and even a pastor from a conservative congregation. Each brought their own perspective, and the sessions became a melting pot of ideas. In one memorable workshop, Elijah asked the group to write down their biggest fears about this work. "I'm afraid people won't listen to me," one woman admitted. "I'm afraid of retaliation," said another. Elijah nodded. "Fear is natural, but every time you push through it, you weaken its grip. That's how we grow." The academy ended with a graduation ceremony where each participant shared their vision for their community. One young man, Lucas, pledged to start a youth mentoring program in his town. "Your stories gave me the courage to believe in something bigger than myself," Lucas said, his voice shaking with emotion. The next community ride was planned as a multi-town event, with bikers stopping in several towns along a designated route. Each stop featured activities like repair workshops, cultural fairs, and open dialogues. The ride began in Elijah's hometown, where he shared a deeply personal story about his father's love of the road and his dream of a more accepting world. "When my dad rode, he didn't see boundaries. He saw bridges waiting to be built. That's what this ride is about, building bridges where walls used to stand." The ride grew as it progressed, with bikers and supporters joining at each stop. By the time they reached their final destination, the procession stretched for miles. The movement caught the attention of a state senator, Patricia Moreno, known for her work on community development. She attended one of their events and was visibly moved by the turnout and the stories shared. "Your work is a blueprint for what every community can achieve," Senator Moreno told Elijah and Sarah. "I want to help." With her support, they secured funding for their programs and gained access to larger platforms, including statewide conferences and policy discussions. As their movement gained prominence, not everyone involved shared their vision. One of their local partners, a business owner, was caught spreading misinformation about the movement online. He claimed that Elijah and Sarah were using funds for personal gain, a baseless accusation meant to sow doubt. The accusation spread quickly, and news outlets began asking questions. Sarah was devastated, but Elijah remained calm. This isn't the first time someone's tried to discredit us, he said. We'll let our work speak for itself. They held a town hall meeting, inviting the community to ask questions directly. Dozens of volunteers and participants came forward to share their positive experiences, effectively silencing the rumors. The business owner issued a public apology, and the movement emerged stronger than ever. Emma, now in her second year of college, returned home for the summer with new ideas and renewed energy. She proposed integrating digital tools into their efforts, including an app to connect volunteers, share resources, and track progress. I've been learning a lot about how technology can amplify grassroots movements, Emma explained. We can reach so many more people this way. The app, named Unity Onward, launched a few months later and quickly gained traction. It allowed users to find events, join discussions, and even access training materials from the Leadership Academy. The movement took a giant leap forward when Elijah was invited to speak at an international conference on social justice. Standing on stage in front of a global audience, he shared the story of their town and the ripple effect it created. What we've built is proof that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life, a community, and eventually the world, he said. It starts with one person willing to cross a line. Someone like Sarah, who didn't let fear dictate her actions. The speech was met with a standing ovation and sparked interest from organizations around the world. Back in their hometown, the movement's impact was everywhere. The mural Elijah painted had become a tourist attraction, and the town's annual ride was now a statewide event. Businesses thrived, schools integrated new programs on diversity and inclusion, and old divisions continued to dissolve. One evening, Sarah, Elijah, and Emma stood together in front of the mural, reflecting on how far they'd come. This started with a broken bike and a stubborn woman who wouldn't take no for an answer, Elijah said with a grin. Sarah laughed. And a biker who didn't know when to quit. Emma looked at them both, her eyes shining. You've changed the world, and we're just getting started.